It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm glad to spend a little time with you today. It's an honor to be speaking to this wonderful audience. It's early here where I'm speaking, and I think we'll have a very productive conversation, I hope. I want to talk about my friend and my colleague of mine, somebody that that you all know. It's 100 years now since the birth of Paulo Freire. So I'm going to be talking about the importance of the work of Paulo Freire at this particular historical juncture that we're all facing. Here in where I am right now in Estados Unidos, in las entrañas de la bestia, the belly of the beast, we're facing situations that other countries have faced for many, many years. And it is the rise of fascism in this country, a particular species of fascism, US fascism. And we're experiencing the rise of fascism all over the world in este momento, in this moment. And Paulo Freire, of course, there are celebrations for Paulo's contributions to education. These celebrations are occurring all over the world. I've been very privileged to have been invited to a number of them. To participate and share some of my recollections of time I spent with Paulo and you know, work I have done regarding Paulo's contributions to education, to liberation theology. There's so many different fields. I could keep counting all the different fields that Paulo Freire has impacted. Now, I'm going to be drawing on some recent writings that I've done about Paulo. So let me begin. You know, the dream of cooperative, what we could call cooperative mutualism associated with democratic regimes has been undermined in recent times by a savage authoritarianism, which has infected many countries, again, many countries around the world, entombing populations longing for freedom inside Foucault's disciplined society, now turned into pandemicized plague towns, filled with the sights and sounds of hacking coughs, bloody phlegm, and the squeaking of hand sanitizer stalls running out of antibacterial refills. Within these plague towns, we witness the outcry of suffering humanity, a disproportionate burden of COVID-19 deaths among racial and ethnic minority groups, particularly Latino, Latina, non-Hispanic, Black, and non-Hispanic American Indian or Alaska Native people. So I'm speaking specifically now about the impact that authoritarianism is making here in the United States and in Canada. So I'll be basically concentrating on what's going on in. Oh, okay. Okay, thanks, no problem. Thank you. So during this inflection point in the history of modern humanity, The spirit of an educator has stood steadfast above the fray, whose philosophy, whose politics and praxis, right, has given the oppressed worldwide assurance, reassurance, and hope. A man whose contributions to the humanization of civilization has challenged the forces of oppression, domination, and alienation throughout all sectors of society. And of course, I'm speaking about Paulo Freire. Although Freire is no longer with us in the flesh, right, his spirit is suffused among all suffering and marginalized peoples. As his teachings continue to be taken up by academics and intellectuals and activists and social movements, all committed to social justice. Although Donald Trump, who's no longer president here, but he still is making a horrendous impact on the politics in this country. He's no longer president, but his impact is really astonishing in a very negative way. Well, he's not here, but he is. And he's never really mentioned Paulo Freire by name, but Trump has attacked the educational left as unpatriotic, anti-patriotic, and he's blaming what he calls cultural Marxism for creating political correctness and the political forces that accuse white men of racism, sexism, and homophobia. So he's largely a white supremacist. He has a following of millions and millions and millions of other white supremacists. This following he has, which we call his base, is poised, I think, for a violent takeover of the United States government. Some people feel this is impossible, but if you recall, I'm sure hearing about and reading about January the 6th, when his base, members of his base, his followers, attacked the Capitol building in the United States. 4 people died, and his base was attempting to possibly execute members of Congress who were inside and who were confirming the election of Joe Biden. I'm not a big fan of Joe Biden, believe me, but compared to Trump, really, well, there's no comparison. Now, the Trump administration, of course, has singled out in their writings over the years a group of German Jewish intellectuals known as the Frankfurt School. I'm sure many of you listening now are familiar with the work of Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Erich Fromm, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this is a group that fled Nazi Germany and came to the United States during World War II. And with characteristic historical amnesia, the Trump administration has argued that this group represents a 5th column and the root of political correctness in the United States. So they're saying, oh, the Frankfurt School, critical theory, critical race theory is responsible for these current attacks on mostly on white people, but mostly white men. And the white supremacists have grown in numbers. They've joined armed militia groups. They're training, right? They're training in different places around the United States for violence, all for the purpose of bringing Donald Trump back to power, right? Now, The main figure within the Frankfurt School is Herbert Marcuse, who studied the impact of technology on human development. Yet members of the Frankfurt School have been accused by Trump and his supporters as fabricating or just making up the ideas of racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, used by the left to attack the right. Not only do the attacks on cultural Marxism absolve the American public from confronting the corroborated and concrete realities of racism, sexism, and other substantiated structural relations of oppression, but they're blatantly anti-Semitic, conceiving racism and political correctness as an ideology created by a group of sinister Jewish intellectuals infecting our university students, right? Therefore, for Trump supporters, there's no need to deal with racism, sexism, and homophobia, since according to them, they do not exist in the United States and have instead been manufactured as ideological weapons by the left to attack conservative white people. And we're seeing this in, you know, the universities these days, of course, where white people are expressing discomfort, and also in high schools, you know, they don't want to hear about slavery. They don't want to really deal with the history of the founding acts of United States as a settler colonial country. And so the right is pushing back, and they're saying, for instance, in some states where they're enacting bills, education bills, in some states, they're actually saying that the teaching of slavery, the teaching of the early history of the United States, like the genocide of indigenous peoples, they're basically saying that this should be outlawed, and teachers should not be permitted to discuss racism. They should not be permitted to criticize the United States in their classrooms. And many of these bills, they haven't been passed yet, but they've been created by the Republican Congress people. And so this is incredible. It's part of the ongoing cultural wars that we've been having in the United States for, you know, basically decades, but now they've reached a kind of fever pitch. Well, so we've entered a kind of post-truth politics that's been so overwhelming that even our most basic assumptions about the meaning of human life fail to comport with any reference to a commonality that individuals can be reasonably measured against, right? The turbulence of navigating through this debris of post-truth politics has persuaded many Anglo-Americans to surrender to an authoritarian politics, which I would characterize as white ethno-nationalism, and to choose the vile politics of white supremacy over fostering reciprocal relations of respect, understanding, and solidarity with people of color, and an interpersonal summons to justice. Well, this has made Paulo Freire's work more important now than ever. The expansion of Freire's work across the mediascape that define our collective lives has never been more urgent, offering revolutionary praxis as a means of shifting the tectonic plates of our contemporary political landscape that is witnessing right now the death of democracy. Now, Freirean education is not so much about discovering the truth of the world through theoretical study and then engaging in a step-by-step application of our knowledge to the world. No, Rather, it's engaging the material world critically in ways that enable an understanding of the world that seizes the will of the learner. Those whom Freire referred to, right, as the oppressed, see a world that they believe has already been written, and they view themselves as having been written out of this world, right? So Freirean critical consciousness is a type of what I call protagonistic knowing, right? That occurs by recognizing. Now, look at this word recognizing, recognizing. The world is an arena of struggle and seeking the means to overcome the privileging hierarchies that constitute this world. Effectively, rewriting the world by being in and with the world. That is, moving outside the fatalism that pervades the technocratic logic of capitalist modernity, which traps so many of the oppressed as victims of history. So for Freire, becoming critically conscious is our path to humanization, to our ontological vocation of becoming more fully human. It's a path that creates the conditions of possibility of becoming agents capable of making history rather than remaining bearers of history's inevitability, right? So this is what forms the basis of a Freirean reading of the word and the world, a reading that's co-intentional. So the student becomes the educator becomes the student. And of course, this is fundamentally dialogical, no? Freire understands that revolutionary agents are not born. They are dialectically produced by various circumstances. Freire was largely concerned with developing a politics of liberation through multiple forms of literacy. He was essentially, I would argue, a philosopher of praxis who was in demand mostly by teachers, at least in North America, mostly by teachers and teacher educators. Yet, of course, he had broad interests. He was interested in regional development and agrarian reform. This is really important. He traveled constantly after his exile. Of course, we know he was jailed, put in prison for about 70 days, and then he went into an exile, a brief stay in Bolivia, a 5-year stay in Chile, where he became involved in the Christian democratic agrarian reform movement. He worked with UNESCO as a consultant with the Research and Training Institute for Agrarian Reform. In 1969, he had a visiting appointment in Harvard University in their Center for Studies in Development and Social Change. He moved to Geneva, Switzerland in 1970 as a consultant for the Office of Education of the World Council of Churches, where he developed literacy programs for Tanzania and Guinea-Bissau that focused on the re-Africanization of those countries. He assisted the government of Peru and Nicaragua with their literacy campaigns. There was the establishment of the Institute of Cultural Action in Geneva in 1971, where he played a role. He returned to Chile briefly after Salvador Allende was assassinated in 1973. And that provoked General Pinochet to declare Freire a subversive. Then there was his brief visit to Brazil under a political amnesty in 1979, and his final return, finally, to Brazil in 1980 to teach at the Pontifical University, Catholic University of Sao Paulo. So from 1980 to 1986, he became a supervisor of the Adult Literacy Project for the Workers' Party in Sao Paulo, and he worked finally briefly as Secretary of Education of Sao Paulo from 1989 to 1992, continuing his radical agenda of literacy reform for the people of Sao Paulo. And what he was able to do, I think, overall in his lifetime was to establish a new type of dialogical humanism through his lifelong engagement with the philosophy of praxis. The strategic centrality, right, of such a praxis manifests itself in a kind of mindful cultivation of the ontological nature of the human being as a starting point for social justice, without at the same time eclipsing or denying the importance of the spiritual self. You know, Paulo was Catholic, but he resisted clericalism. He contributed, you know, he was a critic of the church, obviously, as many of us are. But he also helped. I remember Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru was invited Paulo to help form some of the aspects of liberation theology that was occurring at that time. With, you know, especially, you know, given the Guerra Sucia, the dirty wars that were going on throughout Latin America, many countries in Latin America at that time. So, the central protagonist, I think, the central actor, when I say protagonist, I'm really referring to, you know, actor or agent. Freire's humanism is not God, but humanity itself. What Paulo called the human-world relationship. And it remains within the domain of Freire's revolutionary praxis that spiritual being and human being converge, perhaps even at times coincide, fastened together by an oblate of love, allowing human beings to live in the fullness of history. So that was, I think, what Paulo was about. To create the conditions of possibility, or to make it possible for oppressed people themselves to create the conditions of possibility for them to live in the fullness of history. It's a humanism that begins with ethical action, not with correct doctrine, but with ethical action. And as such fits the central tenets of Catholic social justice teaching. It's a humanism rooted in eros, chastened by logos, a humanism that's consciously aware of the limit situations that face the oppressed, but also those situations, those contexts capable of transcending those limit situations. It's a humanism that begins with a preferential option for the oppressed, an ethical imperative that begins with action, but develops concepts that enable us to reflect on that action, right? In order to name the world in new ways, right? And thus transcend the epistemics of critical pedagogy and social theory, right? So such reflection, critical reflection, never takes place in isolation, but through an engagement with others. Right? Together they discover that the structure of reality is never permanent because it's never finished. They discover that those who reflect upon this reality are also part of this reality. So in sum, reality is never reflected, but always refracted. Right? It's not reflected, it's refracted, right? Like a lens, right? We cannot know the totality of reality, but we can know it at least partially. And in doing so, we can challenge those social relations that serve the transnational capitalist class and bring about the historical concretization of the politics and praxis of liberation, right? So, you know, to sort of conclude in some way, Freire incorporated the totality of his energies in an exemplary way, widening the sphere of liberation and creating paths from multiple arenas of struggle. His historical role as the key reference point in times of chaos and uncertainty has marked Freire as what I would call an archetypal human being. We could call him a man for all times, or a person for all times, a liminal symbol that can be reinterpreted and adapted to fit the times and places of struggle. So he steadied us through different historical periods. He's been holding a lantern in the darkness, giving us a much needed reprieve as we tend to our wounds during defeats, as we realign our energies and reconsider our strategies during victories. The spaces of possibility that are generative of his pedagogy keep the flames of hope alive. Now, so I'll end there, and I'm not sure are there going to be